momentarily. We're just waiting for everyone to get logged on. If you're already here this evening, thank you. It's great to be with you. All right, as folks continue to join us, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia with Politics and Prose. We're live discussing Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America with panelists Curtis Bunn, Nick Charles, Michael H. Kottman, Patrice Gaines, and Keith Harrison. We'll put a link in the chat column so you can purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question this evening, please direct those to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll move to questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To enable captions, click the CC live transcript icon at the bottom of the screen. And before we begin, we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us. We're very grateful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. Now let's get to this great book. For many, the story of the weeks of protests in the summer of 2020 began with a horrific 9 minutes and 29 seconds when police officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd on camera, and it ended with the sweeping federal, state, and interpersonal changes that followed. It's a simple story wherein white America finally witnessed enough brutality to move their collective consciousness. The only problem is that it isn't true. George Floyd was not the first Black man to be killed by police. He wasn't even the first to inspire nationwide protests. Yet his death came at a time when America was already at a tipping point. In Say Their Names, 5 seasoned journalists probe this critical shift with a piercing examination of how inequality has been propagated throughout history, from Black imprisonment and the convict leasing program to longstanding predatory medical practices to over-policing. These authors highlight the disparities that have long characterized the dangers of being Black in America. They examine the many moderate attempts to counteract these inequalities, and finally outline the momentous changes that have resulted from this movement, while at the same time proposing necessary next steps to move forward. We'll link to their full bios in the chat as well, but without further ado, on behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Curtis Bunn, Nick Charles, Michael H. Kottman, Patrice Gaines, and Keith Harrison discussing Say Their Names. Thank you all so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Go ahead, Patrice.
Oh, am I starting? All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I think we'll start maybe at the beginning of this book, which talks about the period of time that will forever stay in our minds, how Black Lives Matter came to be, and something about the organizing. And so I think, Curtis, you want to talk about that? Maybe if we speak a little about as we go through this story.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start with just how the idea originated, because it's a unique concept with 5 writers working on one book in one voice. And Michael Kottman reached out to each of us in the summer of last year, believe it or not. And we were all intrigued immediately when he posed the idea of coming together with this book. I don't know if the idea was fully hashed at that time. We kind of got together once he decided on the writers, and we figured out where we wanted to go with this work. And, I think we only had 3 or 4 months to put this thing together, which was a challenge, certainly, but it was also a level of excitement for all of us because we live in this world and we care about it. And we've covered politics and education and police brutality and prison reform and pretty much everything under the sun over the years. So the opportunity to chronicle it in real time was interesting. I think we all right away understood that we were chronicling something that was going to stand up in the history of the time. And when people are going to look back at this point in American history, they're going to be reading this book. And so we wanted to do a real diligent deep dive under immense pressure in a short time frame, but I think we did it well. We did it conscientiously. And I think what you have as a result, you have a book that not only talks about what happened last year with the social justice movement and the impact of COVID-19, but also putting it in historical context. For me, intuitively, I knew about the ills of what has happened to Black people in America over the years, over the centuries. But to focus on the research and try to put it into context to what was happening now really startled me at times. It made it a difficult project. It wasn't a fun project to do because everything that I learned was reinforcing the troubles that we have now based on what has happened in the past. But I think that was important. It's important to get out. And it's important for people to know and learn from. And I think throughout each page, you're going to learn something new and be able to shake your head and say, well, I didn't know that, but you're going to store it because it matters so much. And I'll leave it at that and let others speak because I love hearing from you all more than I love hearing myself talk, but I'm really proud of the work and this team is as strong a team as you can get together for a project like this.
Well, and during the time that we were doing this, coming together and doing our research on various subjects that we wrote on, we were all also living through this time, the pandemic. And so we knew that this had to be included in the recount, that what happened after George Floyd was murdered, the whole coming together of people to protest worldwide, that was also impacted by the fact that people were home available watching and seeing this. So we did include in this work about the pandemic, but also about how the pandemic also impacted the Black community. I think, Curtis, that you really delved into the inequities in health regarding this. You want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think one of the misnomers or misinformation, and there was so much misinformation once the coronavirus hit us. Obviously, we didn't expect it to be what it was. I think I even pointed out in the beginning, we felt like Black people felt like we were immune to it, that it could get hit everyone else because we've been through so much. And the running joke was that, it would bypass us. Well, as it turned out, it hit us harder than any other race. And the narrative was that, at least the way that in most cases it was portrayed, it was that because we were Black, as if we were inferior, we had some kind of inferior system that we were going to be harder hit. We were harder hit. The reality was we were harder hit because of systemic racism that has been pervasive throughout the history of time. So when you talk about environmental racism, food deserts, the foods that we are forced to eat that are high in cholesterol, high in blood pressure because of economic disadvantages. So we're talking about the wealth gap. All of those things contribute to us having a weaker immune system and high blood pressure and diabetes and those things that the coronavirus attacked. So that was a very important point that I wanted to make clear. And I talked to some really strong, smart Black doctors, epidemiologists, sociologists, psychologists, physicians who really emphasized that point. And so we wanted to make that point that we didn't get the coronavirus as Black people more than any other race simply because we're Black, but because there were systemic racism issues that we've had to deal with forever, and it impacts our health, our overall health, which made us more vulnerable to the coronavirus. So that was the most important part in talking about that, although I also did get into other health issues that are pervasive in our communities.
I think you mentioned something that's important for people to know too, that all of us have included in each section that we wrote on, and that is about the remarkable people who are doing the work, who are active and advocates, and just people that you may not know who are working on each of these issues. So this book isn't just about what has happened to us or is, but it's also about the visionaries who see a different future for us because they are doing work that will help create that. And so, Keith, I guess we'll ask you about, you wrote about policing, and I think in that you definitely ran across some folks as well who are doing the work to help this change. But if you would talk a little bit about your research and.
Thanks. I focused on policing. It was a big topic, obviously, last summer. It still is. It was a big push for police reform. It has happened in fits and starts, but predictably, when law enforcement, especially state and local law enforcement, is faced with reform efforts, they gather together and they push back. And lo and behold, a lot of the efforts, even in Minneapolis, for instance, there's a big effort to quote unquote defund the police there. And last summer, the city council there said, "Oh, we're definitely going to do that." Turns out nothing happened. That's been repeated in a lot of places across the United States, mostly because of efforts by law enforcement groups, usually police unions, to try to change the narrative, and they have successfully done so. Now, whether you agree or disagree with their efforts, they're doing what unions should do, looking out for their members. But they've done this historically, and what they're doing now is saying, "Look, there's been an increase in crime, and the increase in crime is because a lot of law enforcement officers are retiring early or getting out of law enforcement because we feel attacked. We're talking about defunding police and all these reforms. We can't do our jobs. And as a result, crime is going up. So if that's what you all want, fine." And actually, I outlined several episodes of that in the book, and it's repeating itself right now. Here in Washington, D.C., for example, the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, has suddenly, it started around it started around late summer, where they were frequently being interviewed, especially on local broadcast television, about how the drop in the number of police officers was directly responsible for all these shootings going on, as if police officers in a car someplace or at a desk someplace is going to stop somebody from getting shot or from shooting somebody. That's just not how it works. And in fact, most of the research that's been done on this issue says that there's no correlation between the size of a police unit, a police department, and crime rate. There's just no correlation, but they successfully have changed the narrative, not just in Washington, but in lots of places around the country. And I started my section with a story that was pretty old, with a story of a woman named Dorothy Elliott, whose son Archie Elliott III was shot and killed decades ago in Prince George's County, while he was handcuffed, sitting in the front seat of a police vehicle, handcuffed with his hands behind his back like this, with the windows rolled up, and wearing only undershorts, I should say, and gym shorts. And two police officers who had stopped him for driving while intoxicated said they were looking through the window, and somehow they could see that he had managed to get a hand on a handgun, maneuver his hands up and towards them and point the gun at the officers, and then refuse to drop it. They shot him 14 times and was killed. And I talk about how this has changed Dorothy Elliott's life. Obviously, it was a tragic shooting, but it has completely, since that time, her whole life has been trying to get people to look at that case again. A grand jury looked at that case and decided that no law enforcement, the two officers should not be held accountable, but the grand jury did decide that the two departments that were involved in the shooting should get better training on how to search their suspects during arrests, and when to actually use fatal force against individuals. But the story was more about her. That part of this of my section is really about how it really has impacted her, because for every person that gets shot by police officers, and if you're a Black person, you should just know that law enforcement shoots a Black person. At least last year, shot a Black person fatally in this country once every 38 hours. that it impacts not just that person who was shot, obviously it does, but that person usually will have, a mother, a father, a wife, sons, daughters, and it impacts the entire community that way. And if you think about that, that's once every 38 hours. So that means what? It's like 6:16 p.m. Eastern time now. So we're talking about what? Who's the math person among us? 38 hours from now, it's going to be a Black person shot. There's a Black person shot right now. There's going to be another Black person shot 38 hours from now. I mean, that's just going to happen. That's how high the rate is. And then that has an impact on the larger community. But the most interesting thing to me was the predictability of the police union, and how they have, done a good job protecting their members, as unions should do. But I'll just point out one other thing and move on. Why is this a bad thing? 17 states and the District of Columbia have some form of what's called Police Officers' Bill of Rights. Just 17 in the District of Columbia. But those 18 jurisdictions account for 54% of all police shootings. And the reason is because when they have those police officers' Bill of Rights, it's really hard to convict them. It's hard to investigate them. It's hard to convict them. So anyway, that's the highlights of my section.
I want to just remind people also, if you do have a question, to please put it in the Q&A, down there in the Q&A, and we will get to your questions about 6:45. One of the things, Keith, when you were talking, in which all of us can talk about this maybe toward the end, is for people to remember that while we're doing this research, we are journalists and we are writers, but we are also people, and we are Black people. And so in many ways, the information that we're finding is very painful to us as we go through this. So we're doing this during a pandemic, and as all of these shootings are occurring, and we're delving into this research. And on that note, I'll kind of talk about what I wrote about, because I remember being extremely depressed at times by some of the information I was finding out, because I wrote a section that I call Locking Up Black Lives. So it's about mass incarceration, but it's really about punishment in this country, and how since public punishment has existed, Black people have always been impacted more, to a degree much greater than white people. And I focused my story on Philadelphia, using Philadelphia just as an example of any urban environment, and used it because there's a lot of data available, but also because the first penitentiary in this country was in Philadelphia. And I thought that I knew so much about incarceration, one, because I am a convicted felon. When I was 21, I was charged and convicted with possession of heroin, possession with intent to distribute, and possession of a needle and syringe. So while I managed to commit my crime before mandatory sentencing, so I didn't have to go to prison, I was in jail, but I've had to live with that label of a convicted felon. So I know how that can change your life in a number of ways. When I was doing this research, I found out how people who have those kinds of convictions, well, Black people, earn in a lifetime $100,000, on average $100,000 less than a white person, and in fact earn it could even be, well, as we well know, Black people who don't have convictions earn less than white people who have convictions, you find in the research. But when I looked at what I did was look at the history of punishment. And so I started with the penitentiaries in the North, but in the South, they didn't need penitentiaries because they had slavery. And slaves very seldom made it to a courthouse. The justice was done, on the plantation. But after slavery, the country still longed for free labor. And so after that, they came up with Jim Crow laws, with the Black codes, all kinds of ways in which Black people could be incarcerated. And when they did that, they came up with a system of convict leasing. And so most of the people who were leased to do the labor that was dangerous, the mining, working in chemical plants, were Black people and were often worked to death, particularly in the South. In the South, if you leased a convict, you pretty much bought a human being. In the North, you rented them and they went back to the facility in the evening. In the South, you took them and put them on your farm or wherever, and you could work them to death. And if they died, quite often, well, now they're finding mass graves at sites like where there were sugar cane was grown or where mining was done, and people were just, their bodies were left there. And so we had the convict leasing. And then, of course, as we got on into the more modern times, we had the laws that changed that continued to incarcerate people, Black people at a higher rate. We had the laws around crack cocaine, where you got much more time for crack cocaine than you did for cocaine, although they are chemically pretty much the same. So this is a pattern that has continued in our society, even though Black people make up about 13% of the population. We make up about a third of the 2 million people who are incarcerated, about 33%. And so what we had hoped to do with all of these, and what I had hoped to do with the information in Locking Up Black Lives, is to show that Black people, even the people who, who were extremely frustrated after the George Floyd killing, even if you didn't know the stats, you knew the story in your heart, because you knew somebody whose son was incarcerated, or somebody who couldn't get health care because they were too poor to get the care they needed, and it wasn't offered in their neighborhood. But all of these frustrations that came together to create this kind of what we wrote about here, this uprising. And then what we see that is always very important, and that is different today than it was during the civil rights era, is the role of the church. And Nick Charles wrote about that, and I thought it was pretty fascinating what you found out.
I've been excommunicated, so that's fine. The history of this country started with the twin original sins. The first sin was the elimination of the indigenous folks, and the second was the enslavement of folks, Africans, and then progressively people of African descent. One of the things that worked, that changed from the people who were fleeing persecution to come to this country, was also the idea of religious freedom. And somewhere in the 17th century, it changed, the 16th, 17th century, it changed to a reason to eliminate the indigenous and to enslave the African was you had the lash in one hand and the Bible in the other hand. And throughout the history, one thing that people of African descent also adopted and clung to and then transformed was this notion of religion and Christianity and saving of souls and the next life and heaven. And somewhere, I think in the early part of the century, going into the 50s and 60s, comes along the civil rights movement, which was headed by mostly, at least on television and the mainstream press, ministers and people in church. And the thing about people thinking, oh, this was a grand design strategic plan, it really wasn't. There was a very few men up front, a lot of women in the background, pushing an agenda that wasn't even popular then with other Black people. People forget how vilified Martin Luther King was. People forget how vilified SNCC was, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. People forget all these different things. And here we have now, here comes, sorry, Jackie, here comes the summer of 2020 and the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. and everybody's in the street. The pandemic played a part in it, people's attention, people want to get out of their house. But that movement was not led by the church. It was led by what we call the organization called, or the loose connection of networks of an organization called Black Lives Matter, which started basically in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin. Started by 3 women, several of them who were queer. And these are folks who nominally are not exalted in the church, who don't have church leadership positions. And for me, that was very interesting. And doing this research, I came to find out that there are more women in seminary than there are men. It's just that when they get out of seminary, there aren't any pulpits for them to preach it. And part of that is because the folks who are still left in the church, who are older, usually older and female, rather get their guidance and their spiritual leadership from a man than a woman. And so you have these different tensions about people who are transforming the church or who are looking into the church. The church doesn't have a great record and a lot of progressive or transformative areas. They don't have a good record during the HIV/AIDS crisis. They don't have a real great record even in the last presidency, when you could see some people in the church siding with the guy who was the former guy in the office, because that seemed like the thing to do. And for me, it was looking at the church, the Black church first, and saying, hey, yes, it plays a great role in certain respects, but the communities, particularly women and LGBTQ folks, left out of the narrative. And to include them in the narrative, I made sure most of the people I spoke to from my section were women and who represented these congregations that don't usually get a voice. They're not members of mega churches. They're not pushing the prosperity of the gospel of prosperity. They're pushing the gospel of inclusivity. And still the church is resistant to that. Part of my chapter is also about the white church and the idea of, because the most segregated hour in America is still 11 o'clock on Sunday. And so you have the flowering and the mushrooming of what we call white nationalism, Christian nationalism, which is fueling a lot of what we call the backlash to what happened last year. And we have to deal with those things because going forward, the good thing about this book, it's a living document. It's not something that you read and put on the shelf, oh, that's historical. No, it's happening every day, whether the school shooting in Michigan, whether it's about the court case in Wisconsin. You see how race, the effects of racism, systemic racism, and how certain structures we have treat folks who don't look like us. To Patrice's point, all our lives, we've always been journalists. We try to get the facts, get voices, report it. But because we are journalists of color, we are Black journalists, sometimes we can't look past anything. We can't look from above and look down. I know Michael Cotman, covering New York City in the early 90s, was physically threatened. I know of editors who didn't trust what Curtis and I were saying because it came from us until some white colleague said, no, they're right. Or we have the evidence to back it up. So we've always been in this kind of battle of saying, okay, we want to inform, but let's be honest, on my drive home, I'm more likely than one of my white colleagues to get pulled over. The church needs to look at itself. It needs to examine itself. I think Reverend Jackie Lewis, who is the pastor of the Middle Church here in New York, which unfortunately burned down last year, but now is being rebuilt. He said that if the church doesn't change, what use is it? If a church is not inclusive, what use is it? If you're just feeding into a narrative of, oh, do your penance, keep your head down low, praise God, pass the collection plate, and when you get to heaven, you get your reward, what use is it? Why do we always have to wait? Why do we always have to bend the knee, not just in church, but beyond that? And I think Black Lives Matter has challenged that. There's some clergy who have come around, and I'm not saying that all clergy were the same. And I will say that there's some Black Lives Matter folks who are people of faith, but they're also from communities that have all left out. And I'm gonna leave it there because I want to get to some of the questions going forward.
Absolutely. And also we are going to go to Michael Cotman, and then Curtis also, if you have something to add to this. But you wrote about a lot about politics today and some of the achievements, as well though as some of the challenges that we're facing. Boy, do we see that now.
Don't we? I do want to add before I answer this question, I'm so just pleased and proud to listen to each and every one of you talk about your role in this book and the importance of systemic racism and talking about the Black church and talking about policing. I just want to say that just to follow up just a little bit on what Curtis said, because every book has a backstory. And as Curtis mentioned, the story sort of came to me. I wrote it on the back of a napkin after George Floyd was murdered. And I thought this was an opportune time to tell a story about where we are as Black Americans today, where we are with systemic racism, where we are after Trump, where we are with the notion that it's okay to use the N-word, that the notion that it's okay to speak badly about African Americans in this country. Somebody had to say something. I thought about Nick Charles. I thought about Keith Harrison, Patrice Gaines, Curtis Bunn, 4 battle-tested journalists who have covered civil rights over years, who can bring these stories to the forefront. And so I just want to say, just thank you for this hard and courageous work. Was it easy, as Curtis said? No, it was not easy. So I thought about politics. I thought about how politics impacts all aspects of our lives: education, jobs, employment, healthcare. Whether you're talking about a city council election, whether you're talking about a school board race, or whether you're talking about a congressional or Senate race, politics impacts Black Americans. And there are Black Americans to this day, as we know, who are disenfranchised because of politics, right? Because politics is not on our side all the time, which is why we have to vote. Look, Stacey Abrams, perfect example, just announced her candidacy for governor of Georgia for the 2nd time, right? Atlanta just got a new mayor just last week, right? The power of the vote is so crucial. So I wrote about who will stand up for us, who will champion our causes, who will have our backs, who will have the courage to speak our names. And so I wrote about names like Adam Clayton Powell and Barack Obama, David Dinkins, Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Mayor Bottoms, Jesse Jackson, people who were in the trenches. But we also write about new folks too, as they're coming along and hoping that they would groom. And one of the things that, I've talked about over the years is the, I feel like some of our congressional leaders sometimes, I say, testimonials for term limits. We need fresh voices. We need fresh perspectives. We need new and young people, in politics, and we're seeing that now. So I thought this was crucial. I wrote about being in the thick of, in 1992, 10,000 white off-duty New York City Police Department officers, many carrying guns, many drinking beer, using the N-word to protest the policies of David Dinkins. This is when Rudolph Giuliani was beginning to run against Dinkins. And so I'm in the middle of this mob, right? One of the few African Americans in the mob and one of the few African Americans reporters covering it. When one of Mayor Dinkins' security officials asked me, did I want to come inside of City Hall? This was right outside of City Hall, by the way, for my own protection. I stayed because I wanted to cover the story, obviously, and I had to cover the story. But here's a story, just visual, of politics in your face, mean, ugly, racial politics, right? That we have to cover. We have no choice. And I talk about this all the time with you and with Nick and with Curtis and Keith. We can, as journalists, we can go home, file our stories, put our stories away, and we're done for the night. But we're never finished being Black. And so we always have to remember that as we go about our duties. But I also wrote about just one quick thing about the hope for the future. And I thought that was important because I want to let people know that, yes, there's a lot of heavyweight material in this book, but there's also uplifting, the power of the human spirit, an uplifting aspect of it too. So I talk about, Craig Kirby, a former Democratic operative, who's now created a golf foundation for young Black kids and kids of color to learn the business of golf, right? And he talks about politics along the way too with these youngsters, but the most important thing is former political operative trying to change lives. I write about Neil Foote, former reporter, works now with the University of North Texas, changing lives and teaching journalism. He was just inducted in the NABJ Hall of Fame, so really proud of him. But in the trenches for years with Black journalists, trying to change lives and trying to bring these stories, powerful stories, to the forefront. I'll leave it at that.
Curtis, you want to add anything on that?
Just briefly, I think no matter what, the real changes has to be political change. And so that's why politicians are important, those who have our interests at heart, who are fair and honest, and will fight the fight that the Black Lives Matter protesters are marching for and we're all writing about. And I think the future, someone put in the chat, asked a question about the pathway forward. I think that's the pathway forward. I think everybody would agree that we have to get these changes in laws to make some real change, particularly with police brutality and police behavior, that kind of thing. But I in the book, I talked to 5 young leaders in high school, all women from various parts of the country, who are so committed to the cause. It makes me feel like we do have a future. I probably won't see the change, and no, depending on how old you are watching, you may not see the change, but change can be on the horizon, because these high school students were leading marches in San Francisco, in St. Louis, in Chicago, saying they're putting their lives on the line because they received death threats, but they're committed to the causes because their peers are being killed, or people their ages, so they can relate to it far more than we can, because of they have the same interests and we're in the same age group and they're living in the same kind of a lifestyle. So that's encouraging for sure. And I think Michael's point, the book is heavy and there's a lot of information in it that certainly will make you pause and think. And so it was important to also sort of show a pathway forward, maybe not the direct line, but to show that there are others who are young enough to carry on this idea that this mission isn't over, but and no one's going to give up on it.
I think on that note, maybe we could have each person answer. That was a question from Arabella Grayson, who asked that each panelist, what is the prescription for moving forward based on your findings writing the book? So I think in each of our areas, we may have found some visionaries who spoke to that question of that answer of how we move forward in a different way. Keith, you want to?
Okay, sure, yeah. Well, when it comes to police reform, I would, I'm not an anti-union person at all, but my emphasis would be, it sort of pulls off of what Curtis just said. On the state levels, changing laws. The state of Maryland, for instance, last year finally, which happened to be, by the way, the first state in the United States of America to enact a police officer's Bill of Rights, essentially gutted it. It no longer exists. That needs to happen on the state level everywhere. Again, because I don't want to get into too much detail, but essentially in those 17 jurisdictions and the District of States and the District of Columbia that have some version of a police officer's Bill of Rights, those were created to essentially make it impossible to investigate or prosecute police officers for a variety of things, including the use of fatal force. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, and I sort of, I've moved on this, is to take some of the burden off law enforcement. This defund the police movement is something that is often misinterpreted. But police officers shouldn't be spending their time making traffic stops for no reason. For one, it gives them an opportunity to stop people if they are not good cops. And it just gives them a reason. They can make up stuff and say, well, you didn't stop at that stop sign, so I'm going to stop you. They shouldn't do that. They shouldn't be brought in to deal with people with mental health issues when they're not really trained for it. Because no matter how, they may spend, 2 days out of their time in the police academy on focusing on how to deal with people with mental health issues. That's not enough time. That doesn't make them experts on it. And there are other areas that police officers just don't need to be involved. But those would be the two main things. And the other thing is changing the laws on those rare occasions when police officers are actually charged related to some fatal shooting. You have to enact some laws on the state levels to make sure that give jurors in criminal cases some help in getting from hearing the case to a conviction, because right now it's just too hard. And often what defense attorneys do is rely on systemic racism, and they focus on, well, the guy was shot, but 5 years before he was shot, he was convicted of armed robbery and so and so and so and so. So he was probably up to no good, and those kinds of things influence jurors because they're human. But that's what I would say.
Keith, can I ask real quick, when you say the officer's Bill of Rights, you didn't use that phrase qualified immunity, which I'm more familiar with and everyone's familiar with. Is that part of that Bill of Rights you're talking about?
It is not. Well, it is. It has been on the state levels. The place where it's the biggest problem is on the federal level, qualified immunity, because it essentially absolves government employees of any wrongdoing, as long as they were essentially acting in good faith as part of their job. And it's just impossible for the most part to prove that they were not acting in good faith. And case after case gets thrown out. If victims and their families don't find justice on the state level, they can go to the federal level. Dorothy Elliott, who I mentioned when I first started talking, her case, her family filed suit against the two law enforcement agencies that employ the officers who killed her son. And she filed a federal lawsuit, and at the district level, the judge said the case could go forward, but it was appealed to the next level, the Court of Appeals, and the judge said, sorry, we can't hold them accountable. You can't prove that they weren't acting in good faith. So yes, it's a doctrine. It's not a law, it's a doctrine. And in fact, I spend like the last, I think, third of my section talking about qualified immunity. Thanks for bringing that up, Curtis.
Nick, do you want to? I know you mentioned about
I think two of the things I think about that need to be done. The person asked about what needs to be done going forward. Stop centering white people. They're not the centers. We bring them in our media. We have to stop sending them in our institutions. And and also the idea of politics, yes, abolishing the filibuster will help get some legislation through. But also when we talk about addressing things like the police, you can't keep voting for middle of the road, mealy mouth politicians who change is inevitable, progress isn't. And you get progress by having folks who will push the ball down the field. I have no animus against the new mayor of New York City, but that he could even be connected with the thought of bringing back stop and frisk is disgusting to me. But the constituency that is pushing it, the people who are writing the propaganda in the mainstream press, the folks who live in the Upper East and West Sides of Manhattan are scared. And so those are the folks we keep centering and appeasing. Those are the folks why our kids still go to substandard public, because money is siphoned away or not given. Money is being wasted. Nobody talks about the money being wasted for 20 years in Afghanistan. The military grows every year, but the education budgets get cut. We have to reprioritize certain things. And reprioritizing has to be about false equivalency that we sometimes do as journalists in the media, which is, you look at the numbers, the present president has the same numbers as or lower numbers than the last president. But the equivalence, the false equivalence is the present president can't get anything past it because there are two senators ostensibly Democratic who are basically holding the line because they know that this is an opportunity to really move the country forward and no longer entitle certain groups. And therefore you have this thing about, oh, it's a failure. And the guy before was trying to overthrow the government and will try it again if re-elected in 2022. So, or 2024. So the idea is there's no magic bullet. There's no quick fix. It's all hard work behind the scenes. It's the folks you don't see, you don't hear about, who are every day pushing. You know, now talking about, oh my God, threatened. The people who are going to suffer the most if Roe v. Wade is rolled back, again, change but not progress, will be Black and brown women. Because the services, the medical services are geared towards helping those communities, and abortion is a very small part of that, are now going to be, you're talking about defunding something. That's going to be defunded. You know, people talk about get rid, abolish Planned Parenthood. You know, and so the idea of police, you know, my uncle's a cop, drew his gun twice. You know, we are here to keep certain communities in line.
Thank you.
As long as that is the mentality, that's going to be the struggle.
Do Curtis and Michael want to say anything before I was going to?
Well, I'll just say something real, and thank you for all of that, Nick and Keith. But I think that the judges that are in place, when we talk about these appointment of judges, and you know, we don't pay much attention to the midterm elections and these appointments. And you look at what happened in Minneapolis, where that judge was very influential, and I would say in the outcome of that case. The fact that that kid, 15 years old, had a weapon, or 16 had a weapon, and that charge was dropped. And he was 16 at the time, and shot 3 people with it and killed 2. I still don't understand that. So we've got to get judges in there, and this progress that, I thought that was a really good point, Nick. Change is going to happen, but will progress happen? You got to get progressive people in there who want to make change and who want to be fair-minded and thought-provoking in their decision, and quite frankly, courageous too, because they have to go back to their neighborhoods, and we know what those neighborhoods look like. So I think the judging part of it is very important, and we often overlook that. And
well, I think one of the things that you mentioned, Curtis, and that case you're talking about, the Rittenhouse case in Wisconsin. And it wasn't in Minneapolis, it's Wisconsin.
I'm sorry, yeah.
No, but I just want to make sure that Minneapolis doesn't get a bad rap.
Yeah,
but you know, that's the next book. We have so many systemic issues in so many organs. Judicial is one, the media is another. We focused on several, but there's so many other things. Education, which is a book by itself, about how our kids are not educated. And so there's battling, and people get wary, people get tired of it. Look at the pandemic. People talk about pandemic fatigue. My attitude is like, well, are you going to get tired when you drop dead of COVID, as opposed to keep fighting it? That's the reality. You have to be vigilant, and it's taxing. And somebody in the chat talked about, what do you do in a moment like this to keep your going, and how do you do your job when all of this stuff is going on? Well, on your friends and your colleagues and the people you trust and your family.
I just wanted to add to that last question too, about moving forward, that I've called myself an abolitionist for probably 2 decades, but I know it's a word that some people are afraid of, like abolishing corrections. But the idea is that correction should not be the only option when someone commits a crime. Not our corrections as it exists. There are other countries in this world that handle it totally different and have less crime. And so in the book, I talk to people who know this and who are working on this, and I talk to abolitionists. And the thing about abolitionists too, and about doing away with corrections, recently a woman told me, a white woman told me about an incident she was involved in where someone she loved was was killed by a young black guy, a young kid. And this was one of her white relatives. And she said afterwards that she and the family of the young guy ran into each other and just cried together and hugged one another, because what they understood was there were two lives gone. And what she said she began to think about at that moment was she was wishing that there was some other way to deal with that young man's issues, even though he had killed a person she loved. She wanted an alternative to sending him to prison for life. And so I think that is the whole question, is what are the alternatives? And there are people who do work. I talked to a woman who does work, who offers people alternatives, who a restorative justice program where a victim gets to talk to the perpetrator, or, and they can come up with a solution that that the victim is really okay with and feels, in fact, better than just sending someone off to prison. I would say one thing we all do in our chapters and in our research is to provide some hope for what a different future could look like. So let's look at another one of the. Is there a particular question you guys see?
Can I just say something about that question quickly?
Oh yeah, sure, please do.
I just wanted to, when you talk about that path, the path forward, which I think is a very important question, and thank you. I just wanted to read just a quick quote from someone I quoted in the book, Dorothy Gilliam, who's a former Washington Post columnist who we all know and love dearly. She says, "Hope demands action. It's not static. It demands forward movement. When we focus on what we have in our ancestors, not what we don't have, we see God's power within us." The reason I raised this quote, and I loved it and just wanted to expand on just a bit, is the first part, just the first 3 words: hope demands action. And what I thought about, what struck me was thinking about when we are frustrated and angered and disappointed in our political system, and how the system may not be working for us, is not working for us. Somebody asked me that question not too long ago. My answer was, get off the sidelines and get involved. When in 2008, I interviewed Barack Obama on the campaign plane days before the election. That campaign plane days later turned into Air Force One, right? I asked him that question. His point is, get involved. If you're upset, you don't like the system, get involved. I talked to so many people who are angry. There are so many ways to participate in the political process. And that's what we have to do more of. And I'll end it with that.
Well, and you know what I wanted to say about that word hope, it was really funny or ironic how many times it came up in this book in people that we interviewed, and how important. And in the fact that I interviewed a number of people who were formerly incarcerated and told their stories, but that was one of the things that they said was, and these were people, they weren't sitting together because we all had to do our research, not physically, generally with people because of the pandemic, but they mentioned that there would be a time in their lives as a young person where there came a point they had no hope. They felt hopeless because of their situation, whether there was a young guy who had held a friend who had been gunned down, and he held him as he died. He had been hungry for many weeks. His father was addicted at the time. I mean, this hopelessness. And he said, when faced with that hopelessness, you have to make a decision. And you can imagine being a young person, what is that decision going to be? How am I going to feed myself? What will I do? And so it is, ultimately just one of the most important things is, how do we create hope for people, and how do we keep that hope alive? How do we do that? Keith, you're saying something?
Just one quick thing, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna make this quick, but just going back to something that Nick said. We can get involved more in politics, but can't keep giving away, as a Black community, we just can't keep giving away our votes, getting nothing in return. We did that with this current administration, promised police reform on the federal level. Where is it? Promised Voting Rights Act, where is it? And we have to be a lot smarter about how we as a community, maybe pattern ourselves after some other communities, and how and what we do with our votes, and how we contribute to campaigns, because it hasn't been working. And it just hasn't been working.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say on that little note, when I interviewed one young man and he talked about this time now with after George Floyd, how he still doesn't have hope. And I said, I went back to this quote by James Baldwin that says, what is it you want me to reconcile myself to? You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?
One of the things too, I think that we didn't discuss in the book, which is paramount and is playing itself out, and this is for the second book again, is economics, a class analysis. And that is very important because, communist is a bad word, socialist is a bad word. If you want to get universal healthcare, you're a socialist. You want to defund the police, you're a socialist. It's the same names they threw around at Dr. King when he was talking on the Poor People's Campaign. Those things have not changed. There's old tropes, the same dog whistling that goes to even our community, and they get scared and they pull back. And to Keith's point, it's not about abolishing police to the point where we don't want them to be able to function, but understanding that the way that was born out of slave patrols has not really gone away. The idea of lessening police burden around mental health stuff is great. So maybe it's not defund, but reapportion the funding so that the funding goes to mental care folks, social services folks who have expertise in dealing with people who are just agitated or who have mental issues that only now are being diagnosed, like bipolarism, stuff like that. So those are the things we have to look at and not think that there's no black and white, there's lots of gray, but there's also a sense of right and wrong. And too often we are on the right side of history, but it's not always as apparent as we would like. I'm sure when BLM folks were getting all the criticism in the early days of marching in the streets and, down in St. Louis, they were taking a lot of stick. They were taking a lot of stick from black folks too. History has proven they were on the right side of history.
You guys, any final thoughts? You might want to address something that's been asked, or any final thoughts about anything that you came across as you were doing your work?
Well, I don't have a final thought per se, but I know we had some questions in the chat we didn't get to. One of them was about the current administration's focus on voting rights. And I just say in Georgia, where I live in Atlanta, it is a state that has shown it has some political, it's changing its color. The election, the re-election, I guess, of Raphael Warnock as the first Black senator is important. Stacey Abrams now in the governor's race is vital. And so that's one of the states that I would say is critical to what's going on in the midterm elections moving forward.
And let me say, you don't have to live in Georgia to do work in Georgia, because you can do things online. There are all kinds of ways now you can get involved, whether it's, contacting people, making calls. So we need to all go across those borders and do the work.
Somebody just in the chat pointed out that they don't think that we threw our votes. And I also agree with that. For this administration, we didn't know that Manchin and Sinema were going to be obstructionists. I think they want to uphold white supremacy. That's something that we don't talk about. Nobody wants to talk about those things because they're uncomfortable to white people. White people never want to have the conversation that's really difficult. And now that I'm at a certain age and experience, I don't have time to try to modify and pussyfoot around those things because they've existed all during my lifetime. And as Curtis says, I may not be around to see real substantial progress. I've seen enough, seen a lot. But to see real, deep, abiding progress, we have to have those conversations.
Yeah, I'm gonna just reply to that as well. Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, I used hyperbole to make a point. My point is we have to find a way to extract things that end with results. And yeah, you can never tell because of two senators who's supposed to be on your side. You can never know, but you can sort of know that. But you still have to extract things that end in results. And we have to figure out a way to do that. So that we're not sitting here scratching our heads saying, what happened to the Voting Rights Act? What happened to police reform?
Oh my goodness. Absolutely. Well, Julia.
Thank you all so much. We could easily go on for another hour. I'm so sorry to end our discussion. Our audience out there, many thanks to you for engaging with these thoughtful questions this evening. You can find the link in the chat to purchase your copy of Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America, or just visit us at politics-prose.com. While you're there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else we've got coming up for the end of this year and then planning into 2022. Thanks to Curtis Bunn, Nick Charles, Michael H. Kottman, Patrice Gaines, Keith Harrison, this amazing panel this evening. We could not have this kind of discussion without the book sales to support them. From our shelves to yours here at Politics and Prose, we hope everyone out there is staying safe, staying strong, staying well-read, staying increasingly engaged. We will see you next time, everyone. Thanks again to this amazing panel this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you.